After spending 21 years in the US Army, a man retires and moves to Central Florida with his wife and young son. Although his family had plenty of money because he had a pension coming in and his wife still worked full-time, he just got bored really quickly after moving to Central Florida and decided he would just take a job doing something just to stay occupied. And so he ended up taking a job at a highway gas station. One of the primary reasons he chose this particular job is because the owners of the gas station didn't care if his son came along to help him stock shelves and hang out behind the cash register. And so for years, that's just how it went. The man would work at the gas station and his son would tag along. Even after his son became a teenager and you'd think might be wanting to do other things, well, the town was so small, there was almost nothing to do. So his son still came along well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, his son, who was 15 years old at the time, was at the station and he was actually taking a break sitting outside on a picnic table. He was reading a magazine, drinking a Mountain Dew, and it's dark out and he notices out of the corner of his eye that there is a woman walking off of the highway towards the gas station. It was a very quiet night at the time, so there's no cars getting gas, there's nobody there, and there's not really anybody even driving on the highway, and so that's why she really stood out to him. And he turns and he notices her and he thinks to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. So she must have broken down and she must be coming here to try to use our phone to call a tow truck or something like that. So the woman is walking across the lot, coming closer and closer to the gas station, and the boy at this point has turned his attention back to his magazine, but he would say later that he kept looking up and keeping an eye on her because there was something off about her. The woman ultimately walks right behind him and goes in the door into the gas station. Doesn't acknowledge the boy, doesn't say hi to him, just walks straight inside, and she starts walking up and down the aisles of the gas station. Now, from where the boy was sitting, it's all glass, so he could clearly look in and see his father behind the counter, and he could see the head of this woman as she walked in and around all these aisles. And as soon as the woman was in the store, kind of pacing around the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and was just watching. And he noticed that she was not really shopping. She was just looking down for a few seconds, wouldn't pick anything up, so she wasn't buying anything. And she would look up at the counter where his father was, and she would just stare at him, and then she'd look back down at what she was doing, and she would go through all the aisles. And at some point, the woman just kind of abandons this phony, I'm pretending to shop routine, and just walks up to the counter. Now, nobody else is in the store, there's nobody else coming in, and so the boy could actually fairly clearly hear what she was saying to his father. And she told his father that she had broken down and she needed a ride, and could he drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of this gas station. And the boy would say that his father acted very strangely because his father is normally incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He's very chatty even. Like, he talks to everybody who comes in the store. But as soon as this woman had gone in, his dad had seemed kind of dismissive and almost rude to this woman, and when she was talking to him, asking for a ride, he just said, no, I won't give you a ride. The woman is annoyed by how quickly she's been shot down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turns and looks at the boy who's sitting out on the bench, who's looking right at her, and she points at the boy, and she says, what about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride? The boy notices that his father, who's not within her eyesight, is looking at his son going, no. Like, whatever she wants from you, you're gonna say no to it. And the boy's a little bit confused by this because he's still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman, because she clearly needs our help or someone's help. But he just took his dad at face value, and when the woman's pointing at him, he knew, the boy, that if she came over and asked him, he would say no. But it wouldn't come to that because the boy's father would say to the woman, no, my son's not gonna give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not gonna help you. She's furious. She's cussing him out. She storms out and slams the door. She starts cussing at the boy, and she walks off. The whole time she's turning around and flipping them off and screaming profanities at them, but she ultimately walks off. And the dad kind of followed her out and is standing next to his son as she walks off. And the boy asks his dad, like, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why did you not want to help her? And the dad just said, I don't know. There was something off about her, and I don't know how to place it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I knew she had to go. A year later, the boy is in his room when he hears his dad in the other room yelling for him to come in here and look at the TV. So he runs into the TV room, and on the TV is the same woman from the gas station, better known as Eileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. It's unclear whether the boy or the boy's father were her next victims, But by the time she had shown up at that gas station, she had already killed 4 people. And following that interaction with them at the gas station, she had gone on to kill 3 more people, including someone in Ocala, Florida, which was the town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Eileen had been caught, that's why she was on TV, and she was later sentenced to death. In the late 1970s, a medical student going to school in Chicago had just gotten out of class and decided he didn't want to pay for a taxi, so he decided he would hitchhike his way home. Now, this was something he routinely did, and at the time was socially acceptable. So he goes down to the road and he puts his thumb out, and eventually a car pulls up, and he would describe the man that is pulling up as looking normal and even friendly and lighthearted. It's a middle-aged guy, and he tells the student, "Hey, come on in, hop inside, I'll give you a ride." The student did not feel threatened by this guy and felt like overall this was safe, and so he hops in the passenger seat. He tells this man where he wants to go. He says, okay, and they start driving off. So as they're driving, it's silent in the car. They're not making chit chat. They're just driving along. And the student notices that the man misses the turn to go where he needs to go. And so the student turns to the man and says, hey, you missed the turn. Do you mind turning around and going back this way? Or, if you want, you can just drop me off here and I'm happy to walk. We're not that far away. The man, who had seemed really nice and lighthearted, suddenly had this really intense demeanor come over him. And he turns and looks at the student and goes, oh no, you're coming with me. The student is frozen in fear. He doesn't know what to do, but he knows immediately that this is not an idle threat. I don't know who he is. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be bad for me. I have to get out. And so as soon as the car began to slow down even a little bit, they're still driving. They're not stopped. The student unlocks the door, opens the car, and jumps out of the moving car and smashes into the ground, rolls against the side of the curb, but is ultimately unhurt. He's banged up from jumping out of a moving car, but he was able to stand up and run back to his house. He didn't call the police because he really didn't know what to tell them, because he didn't have a great description of the guy, he didn't have his license plate, and the guy didn't do anything totally aggressive. It was more of a threat, but an ambiguous threat at best. It wasn't really clear what he wanted to do with him. It definitely did not seem good, but it just wasn't enough for him to call the police. And so the student just feels lucky that he got out of there and moves on with his life. A couple of years go by. The student at this point has basically forgotten about this encounter with the stranger. And he's sitting in a cafe, he's drinking some coffee, and there's a TV on behind him. He wasn't paying attention to it, but the reporter on the TV said something that immediately piqued his interest. The reporter was talking about a guy that was currently on death row that apparently had removed all of the inside car door handles inside of his car after his first would-be victim, a college student, had apparently escaped by opening a car door while he was moving. The student runs over to the TV and sees on the screen there is an image of the guy they're talking about, this guy on death row, and it's the same guy who gave him a ride 2 years earlier. His name was John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown. He had killed over 30 men and boys in Chicago, and then after killing them in his clown room, he would stuff them into a secret crawl space in his basement. And although we can't be certain, it seems extremely likely that this med student was supposed to be the first victim of John Wayne Gacy, but he leapt out of the car, forcing John Wayne Gacy to change his strategy and make sure the next person was not able to do that. In the 1970s, a young woman and young man were on their very first date together, and it wasn't going very well. It wasn't going badly, it was just really, really awkward. They just were not meshing at all. And so as they're getting ready to leave and retire for the night, the guy is thinking to himself, I have nothing to lose here. We're probably not going to go on a second date. And he says to the woman, hey, do you want to not go home right now and actually come on a hike with me? And he goes, I know this sounds like a terrible idea, but hear me out. I go mountain climbing in this area called Provo Canyon. It's not that far from here. There are these beautiful trails that lead up the side of the canyon to these amazing scenic overlooks. And tonight it's a new moon, so there's great visibility. And I just think that you might enjoy it. And so at first, the woman is obviously a little bit hesitant. But when he says, look, I go hiking there at night all the time. I love it out there. And I promise if there's any weirdness, if you don't like being there, we'll just turn around and leave. It's totally safe. And so after a little bit of coaxing, she finally says, okay, you know what? That sounds fun. Let's go do it. And so their date that had been really awkward suddenly became really exciting. And the two of them were kind of like thrilled, like, wow, look at us making our way up for a nighttime hike through Provo Canyon. And so they arrive at the mouth of this canyon, and they're both obviously excited. And and they hop out and they start walking up this trail that brings them into a heavily forested section of the canyon. Now, to this point, the guy felt like this was a really great idea. He really had gone hiking here a bunch, and he really did know the area well. But as the trail brought them into the forested area, the guy remembers feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. He didn't know why, it was just like an overwhelming sense of anxiety that something bad was going to happen to them. But he had worked so hard to convince his date to come with him, and had convinced her it was safe, that he's not about to let on to her that there was anything wrong with what they were doing. And so he put on, his strong face and just kind of suppressed it and just kept on walking and, holding her hand tight, and they just continued their walk. But his sense of dread would just build and build to the point where he was really on edge. And what he didn't know, but would find out later, is that his date, the woman, she also had this horrible sense of dread as soon as they went into the forest. But she didn't want to tell him because she didn't want to seem like a party pooper, because he seemed really excited about it. At some point, as they're walking down this path, the man steps on something that felt soft. He didn't know what it was, but it caused him to freeze immediately, and he's holding her hand. He kind of jerks her to get her to stop. And before he can even look down and see what he's standing on, he hears rustling coming from the bushes just off the trail. She hears it too, and both of them, without saying a word to each other, because again, you got to remember, they're both really stressed. They haven't let on to the other how stressed they are, but they're both basically ready to leave. And so the two of them turn around and they hightail it out of there. He has no idea what he stepped on. They don't know what they heard in the bushes, but they don't care. The anxiety was so high, they just wanted to leave. Years later, that man and woman who had this very strange date would actually be married. And they'd be sitting down watching TV together, and they're flipping through the channels, and they land on an interview with a death row inmate. And the interviewer is asking the inmate, was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed? And the guy being interviewed says, yes, one time. I was in the forest up in Provo Canyon one night, and a young couple came walking up the trail. I didn't see him, so I only had a chance to jump into the bushes right next to the trail, and the guy actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. But for some reason, he didn't look down and see what he was standing on, and the two of them didn't notice me just a few feet away from them. They just turned around and walked away. Turns out that young couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Before Bundy was executed, he confessed to over 30 murders, but many people believe the true number of victims is much, much, much higher. Between 1974 and 1975, a criminal who had been dubbed the Visayala Ransacker had been terrorizing the Eastern District of Sacramento, California. Initially, he would break into people's homes when they were sleeping by prying open one of their windows. He would go inside and basically ransack their house. He wouldn't steal any of the major valuables that were right in plain sight. He would just kind of throw things all over the place and would take one or two small things, probably as a souvenir. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1976, this Visayala ransacker was not only not caught, but was also no longer satisfied with just breaking into people's homes and ransacking them and taking a few things. He had moved on to killing people, and so he had been given a new nickname, one that just about everybody knew at the time, and that was the Golden State Killer. Once he began killing people, he became much more cautious about how he would actually go about attacking them. He would oftentimes break into his victims' homes while they weren't there, and he would walk their property, look for guns and unload them. He would look for any security cameras or devices and turn them off. He would plant ligatures, pieces of rope and twine that he could use to bind people's arms and legs. He would place them in their house, and then he would leave. And he would study his victims and get to know their patterns and know when they were going to be in the house, when they were going to be in certain rooms. And then at some point he would sneak in through a window at night while they were sleeping, and their victims would wake up with him standing over them with a flashlight in their face. On the rare occasion where neighbors or police had actually spotted this guy, they saw that he was wearing a full face mask and he was very athletic. He was able to elude police capture and would jump over fences and would run away. By the end of 1976, when the Golden State Killer had still not been caught, citizens of Sacramento became furious with the police. They felt like they were not doing enough to try to catch this guy. So on November 3rd, 1976, the police actually host this huge town hall meeting, and they invite all the citizens of Sacramento to come be a part of it, voice your complaints, listen to what police are actually trying to do to catch the Golden State Killer, and basically just have an opportunity to air your grievances a little bit. During the meeting, a man in the crowd who was a citizen of Sacramento stands up and basically starts making fun of the Golden State Killer, calling him weak and a coward, saying, you know, you're preying on women. If you ever came to my house, I would totally beat the crap out of you. Like, this guy's a joke. And everybody in the town hall meeting just totally ate it up. It was like this one little victory for the town of Sacramento is we're going to put down the Golden State Killer for being weak and a coward. Then, in an ironic twist of fate, that guy who was making fun of the Golden State Killer, he and his wife became the next victims of the Golden State Killer. And in fact, the Golden State Killer changed his entire MO. Instead of kind of targeting random people all over Sacramento, he began only targeting married couples, and he would always attack when the husband was home. For decades, the Golden State Killer eluded capture and even taunted the police in threatening phone calls all the way up until 2001. But in 2016, they reinvestigated the Golden State Killer case using DNA evidence, something that was not available in the 70s and the 80s when they were investigating these crimes. And it was through this reinvestigation that they were able to capture 74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo in 2018, who was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. D'Angelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was given 12 consecutive life sentences. When the killer was finally identified as Joseph D'Angelo, police were going through some of the older case photos and they made a startling discovery. This is a picture from the November 3rd, 1976 town hall meeting, and there in the middle of the photo is none other than Joseph D'Angelo, aka the Golden State Killer. And he was there when that citizen of Sacramento stood up and began berating the Golden State Killer, saying how he was a coward and weak and that he would totally beat him up if he ever came to his house. And there's Joseph D'Angelo sitting there listening to this guy. And after the meeting, what does he do? He targets the guy that spoke out against him. And even after he attacked this guy, apparently he was so upset that he changed his entire MO and only targeted married couples from that point on, as if he was proving a point that you can't touch me. By the time Tyler Hadley turned 15, he was skipping school regularly and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Tyler's parents had tried to do everything to get their son back on track between doctor's visits, psychiatry appointments, medication, an outpatient mental health program, but none of it seemed to work. Tyler just was on the wrong path. As Tyler's behavior continued to get worse as he got older, his parents just didn't know what to do, became very frustrated with him, and became very, very strict disciplinarians. One night when Tyler came home and he appeared to be intoxicated, his parents took his phone and car away, and Tyler was furious. And he confided in his best friend Michael Mandel that he thought his parents had gone over the line, that they were over-disciplining him, and he said to Michael that he wanted to kill his mother. Now, Michael knew Tyler and had known him since he was a little kid, and he did not think twice about this claim that, Tyler wanted to kill his mom. He just thought that Tyler was frustrated with his parents, and Michael did know that Tyler's parents were very, very strict and hard on him. So he just kind of wrote it off. Not long after this incident, Tyler starts talking about this huge house party he's gonna have. And all of Tyler's friends, including Michael, just didn't buy it. They're like, there's no way you could ever pull this off. Your parents are too strict and they never leave town anyways. But every time people approached him, he would say, oh no, my parents aren't gonna be there. They'll never find out. At some point, Michael gets a Facebook invitation to Tyler's big house party, and he sees that it's been sent to so many people. It's been sent well beyond an inner circle of friends to just total strangers. And then on the Facebook invitation itself, someone had posted on the wall, hey Tyler, what are you gonna do if your parents come home? And he responded to that, they won't, trust me. On the day of the party, Michael shows up to Tyler's house and it is packed with people. Lots of people he didn't know, and he was fairly certain Tyler didn't know them either. And he goes inside and it's clear that no one gives a crap about the house itself. People are writing on the walls, people have spilled stuff all over the ground, there's broken glass on the ground, people are rummaging through the food in the fridge. No one cared about the house. And Tyler, oddly enough, didn't seem to mind at all. The only time Tyler became on edge was when he felt like the party was getting too loud. And he would go around and tell people to be quiet because he didn't want his neighbors to hear, because the neighbors would call the police and he didn't want the police coming to the house. During this big party, Tyler pulls Michael aside and says, hey, I gotta tell you something, come outside with me. When they get outside, Tyler looks at Mike and just says, Mike, I killed my parents. Michael doesn't believe him, but Tyler says, no, look in my driveway. Their car is still here. They did not go to Orlando. I killed my parents. Michael still didn't believe him, and Tyler said, go inside. I bet if you look around, you'll find blood in my house. So he goes inside and he starts looking around, and when he goes upstairs, he sees there's blood on a table right outside the master bedroom where Tyler's parents slept. And on the door handle to the master bedroom, there was also blood. So he goes back down, and he goes, Tyler, you're playing a prank on me. And Tyler goes, no, when the party dies down, I'll show you proof. At this point, Michael is starting to think this could actually be real. And Tyler walks away, and Michael's thinking to himself, I can't wait till the end of this party to see if this is really true or not. So he goes upstairs, goes to the bloody door handle to the master bedroom, opens it up, and the door actually hits the leg of Tyler's father, who's laying on the ground, who's deceased inside of the master bedroom. He shuts the door and he's standing in the hall and he doesn't know what to do because on the one hand, Tyler's his friend, but he just discovered Tyler's a murderer. He also knew Tyler's parents really well, so he's deeply saddened by what he just saw. And as he's standing there, he's realizing that he has to turn Tyler in. And so for some reason, he just felt the need to take one more picture with Tyler because he knew as soon as he left the house, he was gonna go tell authorities what Tyler had done and he was never gonna see him again. And so he goes over to Tyler and he takes this picture. After Tyler was arrested, he admitted that just hours before this house party, he had bludgeoned his parents to death and stashed them in the master bedroom. Tyler was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while he has been remorseful, he's never given a real reason why he actually killed his parents. On the morning of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, a Colorado high school student named Brooks Brown noted something strange. His on-again, off-again friend named Eric had missed all of the classes that morning, something that is totally uncharacteristic of Eric, who was a straight-A student. At lunchtime, Brown left the high school to go to the designated smoking area in the parking lot, and he saw parked in a very far-away spot, somewhere that he never saw him parked before, was his friend Eric, who was in the back of his car pulling a large duffel bag out of the trunk. Brown puts his cigarette out and walks over and asks Eric, where have you been all morning? And Eric turns to Brown and goes, it doesn't matter. I like you, so you should leave right now. Go home. Brown was taken back by his tone and the general weirdness of the morning, but Eric was always kind of a wild card. He was a guy that had, in the past, vandalized Brown's house. He had posted death threats online about Brown. And then simultaneously, he would brag to Brown all the time about different accomplishments, like he desperately wanted approval from Brown. So it was a very strange relationship they had. Brown doesn't really know what to make of this, and so he kind of just shrugs his shoulders, turns around and walks away, while Eric turns around and continues doing whatever he's doing with this duffel bag. Brown gets back over to the smoking area, and he's thinking, maybe I should just skip class and go home, because maybe Eric has some prank that he's got planned that he's protecting me from. And as he's sitting there, smoking his cigarette, thinking about whether or not he's gonna stay or go, he hears noises coming from the high school that he immediately assumes are fireworks. And so in his mind, he's like, oh, looks like he was planning a senior prank. He's lighting fireworks inside of the school. But then the sounds got faster and louder, and he turned to look at the school and he heard people screaming, and he knew those weren't fireworks, those were gunshots. Brown immediately runs to the nearest house, knocks on their door, and is able to get a phone, and he calls police. After Eric had spoken to Brown, when Brown came across the lot and asked him what he was doing, and then ultimately Brown turned around and walked back to the smoke pit, Eric had turned his attention to his duffel bag. He had pulled it out and dragged it across the lot to another car where one of his other friends named Dylan was also getting his own duffel bag out of the back of his own car. Inside of their duffel bags were propane tank time bombs that they planned to place all around the school in an effort to collapse the ceiling of the cafeteria, because what they wanted to do is get people to start running out of the school so they could start shooting at them. Eric and Dylan's car were parked far away from their usual spots, kind of strategically located near where first responders were bound to come in, and they had rigged their cars to explode so that when they did come through, they would detonate and hopefully take out the first responders as well. Eric and Dylan had also placed another timed explosive on a field about 3 miles away that was purely a diversion. They were hoping it would go off, it would get police and first responders over there first, giving them more time to inflict max damage on the school. But with the exception of the diversionary bomb that did go off, none of the other explosives in the high school actually went off. So Dylan and Eric had to go to plan B, which is to walk right in the school and just start shooting. At the end of the day, 12 students from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado had been killed, along with one of their teachers, as well as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two shooters. At the time, this was far and away the deadliest American school shooting. This senior class picture was taken 2 weeks before the Columbine shooting, and you can clearly see Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold pointing finger guns at the camera. At the time this picture was taken, they both knew what they were going to do to the students in that picture, because they had been planning this attack for over a year and referred to it as Judgment Day. In September 2006, 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander at a big business convention in Las Vegas. The two hit it off immediately, with Travis on the same day he met her inviting Jodi to be his guest at his company's formal dinner that night. After the dinner was over, Travis and Jodi stayed up all night chatting with each other, and the next day, Travis was telling his friends at this convention that he had, quote, found his wife. After the convention was over, Travis and Jodi would continue to see each other, even though it was a long-distance relationship. Travis lived in Arizona and Jodi lived in California. But they would meet up and they would travel and take beautiful pictures and post to social media. It just seemed like they were a dream couple that were so happy together. While the couple's social media posts might have made it seem like they were this perfect couple, Travis's friends began to notice some very strange behavior by Jodi early on in their relationship. Jodi just seemed totally obsessed with Travis. She could not keep her hands off of him. Travis would be talking to his friends and Jodi would come up beside him and literally grab onto him and cling to him. And Travis would try to push her off of him, and she would just come right back and grab onto him. But it wasn't playful and jokey and funny. It was like she literally needed to be holding on to Travis. Jodi would get really upset anytime Travis was interacting with a female. Didn't matter their age or their relationship to Travis. It was like she just could not hack any other females in his life. She would follow Travis anytime he went to the bathroom, and she would put her ear to the door and try to eavesdrop in case there was somebody else in the bathroom that Travis could have been talking to. She began showing up to Travis's house totally unannounced at all hours. And one time when the house was locked and Travis wasn't even home, she snuck into the house through the doggy door. Initially, Travis's friends just thought it was weird behavior, but over time, they started to feel like Jodi might actually be dangerous. And so they sat him down one day and they kind of had like an intervention. And they said, hey, Travis, there is something off about Jodi. Her behavior is just totally weird, and it seems like she is just never gonna let you go. I think you need to break this off and just find a way to cut ties with this woman. As they're speaking to him, they hear something outside of the room they're in, which had all the doors closed. And Travis stands up, walks over, opens the door, and standing right there is Jodi. She was eavesdropping, and she was furious. And she looked in at all of them and gave them absolute death stares and stormed off. Shortly after this intervention, Travis takes his friend's advice and he does break it off with Jodi, and he kind of moves on with his life. Now remember, he lives in Arizona and Jodi lives in California, so you'd think it would be pretty easy to break up because you're never going to run into each other. And that's what Travis was kind of banking on, that he could get a fresh start and never see her again. But about 2 weeks after they broke up, Jodi moved to Arizona. Around the same time, Travis starts dating a new woman named Lisa, and almost immediately, Jodi starts stalking Lisa, showing up at her house, tapping on her windows and running away. She starts slashing Travis's tires. I mean, she was a total menace. She was trying to break them up. But a few months after she arrived in Arizona, Jodi ultimately packs up and heads back to California in April of 2008. And Travis, Lisa, his girlfriend, and all of Travis's friends are so relieved. They felt like now the breakup is final. 2 months after Jodi leaves Arizona and goes back to California, Travis misses a really big business meeting. And at first, his friends are calling him and kind of giving him a hard time about missing this meeting, but he wasn't responding. And after a couple of days, his friends decided they needed to go do a welfare check and make sure he really was okay. They go to his house, they open it up, and immediately when they walk in, they see blood on the carpet, and they're calling out for Travis. Travis is nowhere to be found. They walk through the house and they discover in the bathroom Travis's body. He was dead and laying in the tub. They call the police, who come over and immediately suspect Jodi Arias, who denies that she was ever there, that she had left, she was in Arizona, that she had nothing to do with this. But during the investigation, they find a camera inside of the washing machine inside of Travis's house. They were able to dry it off and extract the last few pictures that were taken on the camera. The first few pictures are of Jodi herself. She's clearly inside of Travis's house. And then at some point she goes into the bathroom where Travis was. He's taking a shower. She takes this picture, and then immediately following this picture, she proceeds to stab Travis to death. In May of 2013, Jodi Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in jail without parole. By September of 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. If this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mud flow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people. Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amero. When he actually arrived in Amero, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out, and they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force, and we really want to get her out, but it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, Omaira went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. And it just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door, and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so, not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of Omaira. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue efforts. Ed Gein was always a little bit off. His classmates and his teachers recalled him being very shy, but at the same time having these strange mannerisms where all of a sudden he would burst out hysterically laughing, usually at something he had been muttering to himself in class. The school blamed Ed's mother for Ed's kind of odd behavior, because Ed would admit that his mother punished him if he showed signs of having friends. So Ed's childhood was incredibly lonely and isolated. Ed's mother would confine he, along with his brother Henry, to their farm. He was basically never allowed to leave with the exception of school, and when he was at the farm, his mother would regularly read from the Bible and would tell Ed and his brother Henry that basically everybody else in the world is evil. We are the only pure ones. Everyone is evil and you should stay away from them. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control and the fire department had to be called in. And after they put out the fire, Ed was okay, but they couldn't find Henry. He was just gone. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed, but then authorities discovered that Henry had actually died before the fire started. And so all eyes turned to Ed, who was the only one with him at the time, but there was no hard evidence connecting Ed to Henry, and Ed said, "I didn't do it." So Henry's death remained labeled an accident, even though basically everyone believed that Ed must have been the guy that strangled his brother to death before the fire was set. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. Ed began to make some modifications to the farmhouse, not to improve it or to make it bigger and better, but rather to board off all of the rooms in the house that his mother ever used. He basically made them time capsules. He didn't touch them, he just sealed them off. And so he confined himself to a single room in this farmhouse that he did not take care of. And so filth is just piling up everywhere. And so he just kind of lived in squalor in this one weird room. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. He basically spent all his time reading about cannibalism inside of this tiny room in his boarded up farmhouse. And that's how he lived his life for the next 10 years. No one really ever saw him. Then in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, her name was Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store to have a look around, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. So they go to Ed Gein's house to interview him and see if he knows anything about Bernice Worden, and so they're bracing themselves for probably finding her body at Ed's house. But they were not prepared for what they actually found at his house. What they find would end up inspiring movies like Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, inside of Ed's house was a whole bunch of human remains, but not in the way that you would imagine. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats and lampshades and bedposts. I mean, his whole house was like built of human bones and flesh. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up to be made into some sort of kitchen utensil or chair or table. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. As for his motive, he told investigators that what he really wanted to do, what he intended to do, was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Here is just a sampling of some of the things that Ed Gein made using human body parts. What is not pictured here are things like his lampshade, his seat, as well as his gloves and his belt. If you feel so inclined, you can Google those things. In 1970, 14-year-old Keith Sapsford was living in Sydney, Australia with his parents, and he was desperate to travel the world. His parents wanted him to be able to travel, they just lacked the resources to be able to afford that kind of thing. However, they were able to pull a little bit of cash, and the three of them did go on a nice European vacation that his parents were hoping would kind of calm down his desires to want to travel all the time. They thought this would be, a taste before he got older and he could go travel as much as he wanted. But when he came back from that vacation, it really had the opposite effect. It was like Keith had experienced the life that he so desperately wanted, and now he's home, and it's like that life has been taken from him. Following that vacation, Keith began trying to run away from home. Not because he didn't want to be around his parents, but just because he saw it as his only way to, see the world. But every time he would run away, his parents would quickly find him and bring him back home. Their concern for their son would only grow, though, because he would find ways to sneak away and be gone for longer and longer stretches of time, and they're thinking it's only a matter of time before he really gets hurt. In an effort to save their son, they ended up enrolling him in this very strict boarding school that was for boys with behavioral problems. And they were hoping that the staff at the school was going to be able to kind of calm their son down and keep him from trying to run away all the time. But unfortunately, the school really had the opposite effect, because the school, in a sense, was like a prison. You weren't allowed to leave. And so immediately, Keith, when he gets there, he's looking for ways to escape this boarding school. And 2 weeks after arriving, he would be successful. He would elude the staff and he would escape. 3 days after he had escaped this boarding school, he found his way to the Sydney airport. Now, this is the 1970s, and it was far easier to get into an airport than it would be today, where there's lots of security. There wasn't much of that at the time that Keith was at the airport. And so Keith walked across the tarmac to a plane that was bound for Tokyo, and he climbed inside the wheel well. He tucked himself in there and he waited for takeoff. A photographer named John Gilpin happened to be at the Sydney airport on the same day that Keith is now snuck into that wheel well, and he had a new lens for his camera that he was testing out. And at one point, he was just taking pictures of the tarmac, and he began taking pictures of a plane that was taking off. And it was the same plane that Keith had snuck into. And he takes pictures of it as it takes off, it goes up to altitude, and it flies away. And he just took a series of pictures of it, puts his camera away, doesn't think twice about it. A week later, John was looking through his photos, and he stopped when he saw this picture. John had inadvertently captured the final moments of Keith as he fell nearly 200 feet to his death. As soon as the pilot took off, the wheels were retracted, opening up that wheel well for a brief second, and there was nothing for Keith to hold on to, and he slipped out. But even if he had not fallen out, he almost certainly would have died from freezing temperatures and lack of oxygen at altitude. On April 1st, 1990, a police officer in Arizona was driving on the highway when he saw a tractor trailer that was pulled over on the side of the road with its hazards on. And so he pulls over, he gets out, walks out to the driver's side door, and he looks up at the driver and says, "Hey, do you need any help?" And the driver is still sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel. He's barely acknowledging the police officer. And he kind of looks down and shrugs and just says, "No, I'm okay." The police officer doesn't know what it was, but there was something off about this guy. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something off about him. He couldn't tell what it was. So he asked him again, "Are you sure that nothing is wrong?" And the driver, again, very sketchy, just says, "No, nothing's wrong." And so the police officer, acting on a gut instinct, says, "Hey, can you step out? Do you mind if I talk to you outside of your vehicle?" And so very reluctantly, the driver kind of slithers his way out of the vehicle, making sure that he doesn't fully open the door to kind of let the officer see what's going on inside his cab. He gets out and shuts the door, and the two start talking. Over the course of their conversation, where basically the officer is trying to figure out what you're doing here. Why are you parked on the side of the road with your hazards on? Why aren't you telling me what's going on? Why are you acting so strange? At some point, the officer just kind of had enough, and he said, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to need to search your vehicle." He opens up the door and goes inside, and there's nothing out of the ordinary in the front two seats. But when he looks into the back section where there was a sleeping compartment, because this is a big 18-wheeler, and there's like a little area in the back of the cab where these guys doing these long drives can sleep. When he looks into that section, he sees there's this woman with her mouth gagged, handcuffed, huddling in the corner of this sleeping section, looking absolutely terrified. The officer immediately gets out and he grabs the guy and he puts him under arrest. As he's arresting him, the driver is saying, "No, she wants to be here. She chose to be here." But the officer didn't buy it, and he said, "You're under arrest for kidnapping." The officer puts this guy in his cruiser and shuts the door, and then he calls for backup. When backup arrived, they were able to take the woman out. She was unhurt. She survived. But it would turn out that she was one of the very, very lucky few, because the driver was Robert Rhodes, aka the truck stop killer, who over the previous 20 years had killed over 50 women. He was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But the crime that the truck stop killer was actually known for was not this kidnapping where this woman survived. It was the kidnapping and murder of a woman named Regina K. Walters. Regina was a young woman who came from a broken home, and at the age of 14, she ran away and began hitchhiking across Texas with her boyfriend. In February of 1990, Rhodes picked up Regina and her boyfriend, who were looking for a ride. Rhodes almost immediately kills Regina's boyfriend and takes Regina captive, and he keeps her chained up in his traveling torture chamber for several years before ultimately killing her as well. After Rhodes was finally arrested by this Arizona police officer on the side of the highway, the investigation searched Rhodes' house, and they found some pictures. This is a picture of Regina K. Walters in the abandoned barn where her body was ultimately found. Immediately after Rhodes took this picture, he ended Regina's life. On September 6, 1992, two moose hunters that were hunting just outside of Denali National Park in Alaska were walking up to a well-known landmark amongst hunters in the area. It was this old school bus that was parked in the middle of nowhere. It was all rusted over and nature had practically overgrown it. And hunters, trappers, and travelers would use this bus as kind of like a center point that you would reference where you were going relative to this particular bus. But when they walked up to it, they saw on the outside of the door that there was a note. "Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is not a joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless." Dated August ? 5 months earlier, in April of 1992, Chris McCandless, the one who wrote that note, had hitchhiked from Carthage, South Dakota to Fairbanks, Alaska. Once there, he hitchhiked again with an electrician named Jim Gallion, who was making his way out of Fairbanks. Chris introduced himself as Alex and asked Jim if he would take him to Denali National Park, which was about 2 hours away to the southwest. On the drive, Jim asked Chris what he was going to be doing at the park, because this is like wild Alaska country. And frankly, Chris did not look like a rugged Alaskan outdoorsman. Chris told Jim that he was going to be living off the land for a few months. Jim would later say that he had serious doubts about Chris's ability to survive in the Alaskan bush. As it was, Chris only had a light backpack, he did have a rifle, but he really didn't have warm clothes on. He only had 10 pounds of rice. That was the only thing he brought for food. He didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map, he didn't have a watch. He just seemed totally ill-equipped for what he was saying he was going to go do. At some point, Jim tried to convince Chris not to go, or to at least postpone, and he even offered, "Hey, I'll drive you up to Anchorage and I'll buy you equipment. You need the right equipment for what you're going to be doing. Let's go there first." But Chris was stubborn, and so Jim ultimately relented and said okay. He drove him to the park. Before Chris left, Jim actually gave him a pair of warm boots that he had in his truck. He said, "Here, you can use these more than I can." And Chris thanked him, took his boots, and he was on his way. Although Chris was planning for this extensive hike through Denali National Park all the way to the Bering Sea, but Chris would only make it about 20 miles into his journey before stopping at an old rusted bus just outside of the park. Chris would live in this bus for 16 weeks, and according to his diary, that first week he was there was particularly rough. He was snowed in, he couldn't catch anything to eat, so he's hungry and cold. But shortly thereafter, he developed a routine. He was able to hunt successfully for some small game. He found some plants that were good to eat, and by and large, his entries made it seem like he was very happy. However, the last month of diary entries really painted a very different picture. After living in this bus for nearly 3 months, he indicated in his diary that he was kind of sick and tired of living off the land and he was ready to return back to society. So on July 3rd, he packs up his camp and he starts walking back the 20 miles towards where he came into the park in the first place. But when he came into the park 3 months earlier, the river that he was going to need to cross was frozen. And now that he's returning in the summer, it had thawed, and now it's the 75-foot wide raging river that was basically impossible to cross. And so he's trapped on the wrong side of this river. What he didn't know, because he didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map, he didn't know the area well, was there was actually a hand-operated tram that would take you across the river in the summer that was only a mile away from his camp that was labeled on almost every map. In addition, there was a hunting cabin not far from that tram that's also on just about every map of this particular area. That had food, it had clothes, it had bedding. He could have stayed in this hunting cabin until conditions were okay again to make the journey back. back home. But again, he doesn't have a map, so he doesn't know these things exist. So at some point, he turns around and goes back to the bus, feeling totally dejected. That night, his journal entry just said, "Reined in, river looks impossible, lonely, scared." All of Chris's diary entries following his return to the bus after not being able to cross this river got shorter and bleaker and really painted a picture of a guy that was going downhill. The final entry in Chris's diary just says, "Beautiful blue berries." And then 19 days after his final entry is when those two moose hunters find this bus and see the note, the SOS note, pinned to the outside. The hunters go inside the bus, and there, laying in a sleeping bag, is the body of Christopher McCandless. Although it's not entirely clear how Christopher actually died, the two most common theories are either starvation or perhaps he ingested a poisonous plant seed. The hunters alerted authorities who came out and they launched an investigation, and during this investigation they found Chris's camera. Chris was an avid photographer. He had taken loads of pictures over the course of his stay out in the wild. This is the final picture that he took on his camera. It's evident from Chris's SOS note on his door that he did want to escape. He wanted to leave the wild. But what's also clear is that at the end, he realized he wasn't going to. The note he's holding in his hand says, "I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord, goodbye, and may God bless all." And so he took one last dignified picture of himself before curling up in his sleeping bag and passing away. In 2014, a 20-year-old man living in India named Maksud Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what caused him to be so fixated on tigers, but they noticed after a kind of random trip to the zoo that he took that he came home and all he could talk about were tigers. So they figured he must have seen tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maksud's obsession with tigers was not just, love and affection for these animals, although certainly there was that. It was more of a dark fascination with tigers' savage nature. The story Maksud used to tell all the time to his friends and family was about this tiger that was in captivity, and one day its two trainers had gone into the cage to put a garland of flowers around its neck for maybe some ceremony or something, and the tiger just wasn't having it that day, and when they went to put it on its neck, the tiger kind of snapped and killed the two trainers. Now, Maksud was not telling the story to kind of glorify the violence of it, or even to act like it wasn't a big deal that these trainers had been killed. He was telling the story with a reverence for these creatures that were kind of untamable, that even in captivity, they were in control, and he was just totally fascinated by them. In May of that year, Maksud lost his job, something that unfortunately happened all the time for him because he was known to be kind of lazy and kind of happy-go-lucky, didn't take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from a job one time when he was supposed to be unloading sacks from a truck and got distracted by some small animal and ran after it, and his employer fired him for it. But his family depended on him, and they said, "Maksud, you got to go out and get another job." And so during the day, Maksud would go out and tell his family, "I'm going out job hunting." But what he was really doing is spending the little money his family had to go to the zoo to go look at these tigers that he was so in love with. So for the next 4 months, Maksud would just lie to his family and would go to the zoo and stare at the tigers in their exhibit. And so one day when he was doing just that, on September 23rd, 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit. Now, the way it was set up is there was an outer fence that all of the people who were at the zoo could stand right against, and it was an open air exhibit. Right on the other side of that fence, all the way around, was a little bit of land that protruded into the exhibit a little ways, and then it would drop straight down into a moat that was another layer of protection between the tigers and people, so they were not interacting. If you continued straight past the moat, it would go back up again to this little island right in the middle of this exhibit where all the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess that it was simply because Maksud wanted a better look at the tigers, he climbed over that first fence, the one that no visitors are allowed to cross. and he walked to the edge of that piece of land that sits over that moat. And he's looking down at the tigers, and the guards are telling him to go back, get back on the other side of the fence. All of the other people that are there watching the tigers as well, the other visitors, they're saying, hey, come back, don't do what you're doing. And at some point, Maqsood fell 15 feet into the tiger enclosure. Immediately, an alarm goes off, waking up the tigers in their habitat. So they don't know what's going on. They're kind of looking around. And the people that are watching this happen from the safety of behind this fence, they're screaming and yelling, and they're trying to get security to come over, and they're trying to save this guy. It's just chaos. But what's really happening is they're totally inciting the tigers to see what the heck's going on. And very quickly, one of the tigers notices that there is now a person, Maqsood, who's in the moat. And the tiger jumps down into the moat and walks right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood is sitting there and he's absolutely terrified. And people said that he was just praying and he's huddled up against the side of the moat. And the tiger's just looking at him. The tiger's not showing signs that it's going to harm Maqsood. But the people that were watching this happen that are on the other side of this fence are either taking videos and pictures of the event, or some of them begin picking up rocks and throwing them at the tiger to try to, I guess, get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone. 10 minutes goes by of people throwing rocks at this tiger, and the tiger gets really upset. And so what do you think happens once the tiger gets upset? It attacks Maqsood. The tiger clamped down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him over to a grassy kind of hidden section within the enclosure. And by the time the staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. Here is the final picture of Maqsood after he's fallen inside of that moat. This is taken moments before this tiger would ultimately attack and kill him. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence for their incredibly long response time and for not having any alternative rescue methods in place. John and Jackie Nill were a Canadian married couple that loved traveling to Thailand. In fact, they went there so often and loved it so much that they considered it their second home. In 2004, instead of spending Christmas with their family back home in Canada, they decided, you know what, we're empty nesters, we're on our own, let's go spend Christmas in a place that we love that's also warm, Thailand. And so they settled on one of their favorite spots in Thailand called Khao Lak. It's this beautiful beach town. They'd been there many times, and so they were pumped. On Christmas Day, they called their family and said they're having such a great time. The weather is beautiful. They have this wonderful beach right in front of them. And by all accounts, their vacation seemed to be going really perfectly. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the couple woke up and decided to head down to the beach to spend the day lounging on the sand. But as soon as they stepped out of their villa and looked down at the beach, which was right outside of where they were staying, they saw this huge crowd of people standing on the sand. And even though it was early in the morning, John and Jackie knew immediately why they were down there. It was an extremely low tide. The water had receded so far that it was a spectacle. And so they had their digital camera with them and they just started taking pictures. What John and Jackie and the people down on the beach seem not to have realized is that that extreme low tide is actually an early indication of a tsunami tidal wave, where the water basically gets sucked way out in preparation for a massive wave. What John and Jackie and everybody down on that beach should have been doing that morning is turning around and running inland as far as they possibly can go and as high as they possibly can go. But they don't do that. In fact, it looks like no one has any idea what's about to happen. And so John and Jackie continue to take pictures, and you see this massive wave coming closer and closer with every picture they're taking until it wipes out everybody down on the beach and eventually wipes out John and Jackie. They would be swept away to their death along with 230,000 other people. John and Jackie's camera would be found on the beach a month later. The camera itself was destroyed, but the SIM card was intact. And the person who found it would take that SIM card, plug it into their computer, and here are the final pictures that were on that SIM card. John Jones and his family were avid spelunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave, which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24th, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, entered Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to the section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decided to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the Birth Canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just got to go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again, and his chest expands, and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip because he's now moved past it. He can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck, and from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's gonna go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time, everything's going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is going to take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is going to take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200 pound man out of this tiny space, that's going to take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. Didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. And so they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. And here is a picture of John exploring Nutty Putty Cave before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful tunnel that he went in headfirst and ultimately died inside of.